Good evening, everybody. Monday night of Parashiot Behar-Bechukotai. So this is the end of our journey through Vayikra with Rabbi David Foreman's um, Parsha companion. I know that there are volumes of Breshit and Shmot and Vayikra. I'm not sure if the set of the Chamisha Chumshei Torah is completed yet, um, but I think we've gotten a good flavor of his kind of I've struggled for the right words, but rhetorical, semi-dramatic, conversational, and a little bit homiletical editorial style, really speaking to the reader and taking us through. That here we'll see an example really of how, you know, if this were a Rav Elchanan Samet essay, we would simply jump straight to the chart comparing, the two passages that he's going to compare literarily, but instead he sort of coaxes us along on the journey and asks us, what should be next? Well, let's see if it happens, etc. So we've gotten very much a flavor, yes, Shmuzi, very much a flavor of his style. Seen that, he's not a kind of a one-trick guy, in the sense that his essays are not limited to sort of connections between passages in any given parasha and narrative contexts, usually from Bereshit, but that's probably seems to be his go-to approach. But other kinds of readings, we've done the one of these things is not like the other approach, thinking about how groupings are created, other kind of literary structures, and attempts to kind of use metaphor and help us think about the underlying psychological realities that and sort of emotional valences of the text. Um, some of the insights I've felt were, good up to a point, but maybe he took them a little farther than was obviously compelling. But they certainly had something to commend them. And in many cases, when he took it to another degree, he utilized footnotes to acknowledge the limitations or to, deepen his argument. And then there were a couple of spots where it felt like, why didn't he use a footnote to sort of, caveat this claim? But for me, a wonderful opportunity to be a little more exposed to his writing. He also has books. I think he has a book. He has a book on kind of the Exodus story connected to the Yosef story called something like The Exodus You Almost Passed Over. I can't remember if he has something on Esther, and he has a book called "Sin Crouches at the Door," I believe, based on some of the Breshit stories as well. And then, of course, his entire website, Aleph Beta, covers holidays and lots of other dimensions of Torah. So lots of easy ways to access his content um, outside of this learning. But hopefully, it's been fruitful for others as well. And let's dive into our last one, long as they have tended to be, but should be digestible for us in the time that we have. This is our second and final 8:45 p.m. start as Mincha Maariv gets later, and for the Book of Bamidbar will be starting at 9 p.m. Apologies for the late hour, but just attempting to make Mincha Maariv possible for those who want to do that too at its regular time. So here we go. He has an essay on Behar. This is the one on Bechukotai called Back to the Future. Parashat Bechukotai plays host to what is arguably one of the most puzzling comments made by Rashi in the entire Torah. Rashi, quotes a midrashic teaching, but it is a teaching that seems wildly anachronistic and jarringly out of context. This all happens with reference to the opening of Parashat Bechukotai, which details the blessings that will come to the people of Israel if they observe God's commands when they arrive in the land of Canaan. As part of these assurances, the text states that the Almighty will walk with the people and be their God. We can look at that pasuk. This is the beginning of Bechukotai, which starts off Im Bechukotai Telecha. If you follow my laws, I'll grant your rains. You'll have, great produce, peace in the land. You won't be, and we'll see these as we go through. Um, you won't be attacked by beasts. You'll have military success. Did I already go past it? Um, a little further. I'll make my abode in your midst. And then in verse 12, V'hitalachti betochachem, v'hayiti lachem le'elohim, v'atem tiyu li la'am. I will be ever present in your midst, is how JPS translates it. We'll get into the details of the translation of that word, V'hitalachti, at the end of the essay. But I'll be ever present in your midst. I will be your God, and you will be my people. Okay, that's the promise. And Rashi on V'hitalachti betochachem, which he translates, Rabbi Foreman translates as, I will walk among you. We saw ever present in your midst as the JPS, but when the verse states, I will walk amongst you, Rashi says it means, Atayel imachem began Eden ke'achad mikem. I will stroll with you in the Garden of Eden, just like one of you. What a strange remark. What does Garden of Eden have to do with anything? We are in the book of Leviticus now, and we haven't been talking about the garden now since the very beginning of Genesis. Right now, here in Leviticus, the Torah is talking to the people about what life will be like in their future when Israel arrives in its land. It isn't talking about the past. So, why are the sages in the Midrash bringing the Garden of Eden into the conversation here? Somehow, these sages seem to be drawing a line that analogizes the future to the past. Somehow, in their view, life in the land will be a version of sorts of life as it was in the Garden of Eden. In broad strokes, that seems to be what the Midrash is getting at here. But that brings us face to face with a question. Why are the sages saying this? Are they putting forth this connection between past and future just because? Or do the sages have any evidence in the biblical text that actually suggests such a hopeful eventuality? That somehow life in the land of Canaan will be a version of life in Eden? But truthfully, even some vague hope that the future will be like the past wouldn't be enough to explain what the sages say here. Because let's say you wanted to make this equivalency and you wanted to suggest that life in a certain place would be Eden-like. What exactly would that mean to you? Well, I think most of us would picture an Eden-like existence as having lots of wonderful palm trees and general rainforest-like paradisiacal elements. But that's not how the rabbis conjured Eden. It's not how they construed what it would be like to relive that plane of existence. Instead, they said this: I will stroll with you in the Garden of Eden, just like one of you. Interesting. According to the Midrash, what would it mean to re-inhabit Eden? Eden is the place where God invites us casually to go on a stroll with God. What a remarkable portrait. Why is going on a stroll with God the defining characteristic of Eden? What makes that so crucial? And more broadly, where are the sages getting their ideas about all this from? In the footnote, he mentions a similar depiction appears elsewhere, and I pulled up one of the instances, Sanhedrin 102a, kind of out of totally left field. The Gemara is discussing, if it will load up, we'll see. One of the kings and the early kingdom of Israel, and says, after God grabbed hold of Yeravam in his clothes, God said to him, Chazor becha, do tshuva, basically, repent. V'ani v'ata uven Yishai nitayel began Eden. You and me and Ben Yishai, could be David, are going to go for a stroll in Gan Eden. And Yeravam said back to God, Mi barosh, who's going in front of in our group of three, you, me, and David? And God says, Ben Yishai barosh, David will be in the front. Ihachi lo ba'ina. And so Yeravam says, if that's the case, I'm not interested. I'm only going for a walk with you and David if I can walk in front. As apropos of nothing, just we get a little flavor that this is a concept out there of L'tayel began Eden, that God invites people to go strolling in Gan Eden. He doesn't come back to how to connect that, but just to show there's a, this is not the only place it shows up, but it's a perplexing, scene, to say the least. Okay, so where are the sages getting their ideas about all this from? The answer, I believe, is that the sages whom Rashi quotes were reading the opening verses of our Parashah quite carefully indeed. For if we too look at these passages, these opening blessings in Parshat Bechukotai, we will see allusions that bring us back to the dawn of humanity. We will find echoes of mankind's very first experiences, seeming to lead us to the doorstep of Eden itself. The sages, I think, saw these parallels and sought, with their very brief remarks, to help us interpret them. Let's explore some of these links between Parshat Bechukotai and the very beginning of Genesis. Come back with me for a moment to the original creation story, and let's refamiliarize ourselves with the events of the sixth day, Going into the very first Shabbat. Just after mankind was brought into existence on that primal sixth day, we're told that God blessed this new species. That blessing has a number of elements, but it begins this way. Vayevarechotam Elokim, God blessed them, and said, Pru urvu milu et haaretz v'kivshuha, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and conquer it, and dominate the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every animal that roams on earth. After we hear of mankind's promised dominion over the animal world, we hear of a similar dominion that humans will exercise over the plant world. Next pasuk. And God says, I gave you all herb which yields seed that is on the face of the earth, every tree which has fruit and yields seed, lachem yihiyeh le'achla. This will be yours for the eating. Okay, the text tells us that human sustenance will come from plants. We're going to dominate the animal kingdom, not eat them. Remember, that's the Eden version. We'll dominate the animal kingdom and the birds, etc. And plants will be our diet. In the beginning of the verse, we're told that God has given humans herbs and vegetation, and then that fruit trees are ours for the taking as well. Kol eitz asher bo pri, that's second. And with this, the blessing pretty much comes to its conclusion. We hear next about the advent of the seventh day, the very first Shabbat, right? So we have the blessings, takes us all the way to 29. Then it mentions that, greenery, plant life is also given to the animals, but that seems like a bit of an aside. There was evening and morning in the sixth day, and then we have Shabbat. So that's why, of course, he mentions, it's almost the conclusion. There is that one other verse, but it seems like a bit of a tangent. So just to summarize the themes we've seen, there are 5 or maybe 6, depending on how you count them. They proceed in the following order. Mankind's blessing: be fruitful and multiply, conquer the earth, dominate the animals, herbs and vegetation are yours for the taking, as are fruit trees, advent of the Sabbath. Straightforward. Now keep that progression of themes in a handy corner of your mind, and follow me, if you will, back to the book of Leviticus and Parshat Bechukotai. Let's read together the opening verses of our parashah and ask ourselves, does anything here remind you of this progression we saw at the end of the creation story? If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, then I will give you your rains in their season, and the land shall yield its increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. Your threshing shall reach the vintage, and the vintage the sowing time. You'll eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land safely. I will give peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none will make you afraid. And I will remove wild animals from the land, neither shall the sword go through your land. You shall chase your enemies, they shall fall before you by the sword. 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall before you by the sword. I will turn toward you and make you fruitful and multiply you. In these words, God assures us that once we enter the land, if we follow God's statutes, we can be assured of divine blessing. But it's not just any divine blessing that Bechukotai has in mind. The blessings it speaks of seem to hark all the way back to the dawn of mankind, all the way back to the 6th day of creation. Because once you look at these verses very closely, you start to notice that just about every element here reminds us of God's blessing to humans on creation's 6th day. Now he's going to take us through with little interspersed brief comments. Take, for example, the very end of this section of text, where we find these words, and I will make you fruitful and multiply you. V'hifreiti etchem, v'hirbeiti etchem. That's pru or revu. Hifreiti from pru, hirbeiti from revu. The 2 verbs used here in Parshat Bechukotai, v'hifreiti and v'hirbeiti, should sound familiar to any reader of the creation story. Together, they are versions of the iconic blessing that God issues to the very first humans, Adam and Eve. Right? Vayevarechotam Elokim, vayomer lechem Elokim, pru urvu. Right? So we already see here that the last of the Bechukotai blessings mirrors the first of the blessings given to the human being or beings on the 6th day of creation. And the connections don't stop there. Go back to Parshat Bechukotai and look at the words right before this. Just before the text promises that the Almighty will make you fruitful and multiply you, right? That was verse 9. We have this war stuff. We find a promise that if Israel follows God's statutes, the nation will enjoy military success in war. Sword shall not go through your land, you'll chase your enemies, etc., etc. They'll fall before you by the sword. This too seems to echo the blessing that God had given Adam and Eve. For back in Eden, right after God blessed the first humans with fertility, that they should be fruitful and multiply, the next word after pru or revu in Breshit has an unmistakably militaristic connotation. V'chivshuha. Now you can see there's nothing bold here because the actual words don't match. The word lichbosh doesn't appear in this section. So he's doing a thematic connection. After telling man to be fruitful and multiply, God says, and conquer the land, have dominion over the land. That parallels this whole section of military success, which is the second to last of the blessings in the beginning of Bechukotai. Right? In this verse, in Bereshit, God promises this new race of humans that in the end it will be people that put bears in zoos rather than the other way around. Why? Because humans using their ingenuity and superior skills in communication and tool making would dominate the competition and come to rule the earth. They would have success in their first great war of survival. Right here he's pointing out Kivshuha wouldn't make sense even to mean military success as a blessing to the first humans. They didn't have other people around, as we imagine the Breshit story, to go to war against, but they were fighting for dominion over the other creatures on Earth, and so they're contextually equivalent. Parshat Bechukotai's promise of military success in defending the nation's land seems to carry an echo of mankind's first promise of success in conquering the land. Thus far, we've discerned two echoes of Genesis' sixth day in Parshat Bechukotai's opening blessing, but the echoes don't stop here. Here's a third echo. Just before Parshat Bechukotai, so remember what we're doing here. We're now moving backwards up from the end of the Bechukotai blessings to the beginning, as we move forwards down from the blessings to the first humans. Just before Parshat Bechukotai promised fertility to the people of Israel, and just before it promised military success, it promised something else. V'hishbati chaya ra'a min haaretz. I will remove wild animals from the land. The idea that we, Israel, will dwell safely in the land of Israel without fear of wild animals is in fact the third to last element of Parshat Bechukotai's blessing. And guess what? If you go back to Genesis, right after we hear a promise of fertility to Adam and Eve, right after people get this very militaristic promise that they will conquer the earth, we get an element of blessing that mentions beasts of the animal world, of all things, right? Dominate the fish of the sea, birds of the sky, and every animal that roams on the earth. Again, that may just be the application of what it means to, v'chiv shuha, to conquer it, but still we wind up with this connection of animals in each place, and that's bolded because that is a, actual semantic connection. So at this point, we've seen three connections between the blessing of Parshat Bechukotai. Here you see what I mean at the beginning. Instead of just laying out the chart, he's talking us through it. And the original blessing to mankind, just as the human species was first created. But it's not just the number of connections that is significant here. It's also the order in which they appear. Back in Genesis, the first element of God's blessing to mankind is echoed by the last element of Parshat Bechukotai's blessing. And then the second element in God's Genesis blessing is echoed by the second to last element of Parshat Bechukotai's blessing. The same holds for the next echo. The third element in Genesis is echoed by the third to last in Parshat Bechukotai. And now we start to fill in the chart here. So God's blessing to Israel in Parshat Bechukotai, the last three, removing wild animals, vanquishing your enemies, being fruitful and multiply. And the first three in Bereshit, going up, dominate the animals, conquer the earth, be fruitful and multiply. Laid out with the colors, you can see it. So maybe you're a skeptic and you say to yourself, well, that's intriguing, but maybe it's all just a coincidence. To be convinced, I'd have to see more. Does the pattern continue? Well, as a matter of fact, it does. Remarkably, the pattern embraces a fourth and fifth element too. Back in Genesis, after Adam and Eve were blessed with fertility, after they were told about conquering the earth, after they were told about dominating the animal world, they were next told that plant life would be given to them as a source of food. Herbs and vegetation were to be theirs to enjoy. God said, I've given you every herb which yields seed that is on the face of the earth. Lo and behold, in Parshat Bechukotai's blessing, the fourth to last element also revolves around our ability to harvest the bounty that the plant world provides for us. Your threshing shall be so plentiful that it will reach the vintage, and the vintage shall be so plentiful as to reach the sowing time. You shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land safely. Wine and bread, the products of grapes and grain, all these, Parshat Bechukotai tells Israel, will be theirs in abundance. And after that, you guessed it, the two blessings correspond in a fifth way too. The fifth element of the Genesis blessing revolves around trees. And every tree which has fruit and yields seed, these will be yours for the eating. And right in line with the pattern we've been seeing, the fifth to last element of Bechukotai's blessing corresponds perfectly. Here, by the way, in this footnote, he talks about the difference between kind of the fact that the Breshit one is just the raw materials, and the Devarim one is the actual products that would be developed from them. Leave that for now. In Vayikra 26:4, Ve'etz hasadeh yitain piryo, the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. So now we have those next two, working backwards up in Bechukotai, the bounty of the land is yours for the taking, and the fruits of the trees are given to you. And so too in Breshit, we had that thing that he pointed out to us from the beginning, herbs and vegetation, and then the specific fruit trees added as well. So far, all five elements of God's blessing to humankind on the sixth day have found echoes in Parshat Bechukotai. And now I want to consider one more crucial piece of evidence with you. I believe this additional point may help us begin to unlock the meaning behind all these parallels, right? We haven't gotten there yet. That's his usual structure. Lay out the connection and then say, but why? What is this here for? And try to develop that. Let's return to the Genesis Leviticus connection and ask if we can extend the links between these passages one more step. Could there possibly be a sixth element in common here? To see if the pattern continues, we need to go back to Genesis and consider what happened after God issued that blessing to mankind on the sixth day. What happened next? The answer is the Shabbat, creation's primal seventh day. We have that passage at the beginning of Breshit chapter 2, the story of Shabbat. Having established this, let's fast forward to Parshat Bechukotai to see whether there is anything that reminds us of the Shabbat. We would be looking for something Sabbath-like that precedes the five elements of the blessing here. As it happens, just before all five elements are mentioned, we get the following words. They appear just before the blessings that follow. And here it helps that we have a double parsha, because again, as we work our way back up, we have the beasts, we have the produce, we have the fruit trees. Then we see, oh, we're back at the beginning of Parshat Bechukotai. So it seems like it ends if we want to keep going up. So now we have to back up into the end of the end of the previous week's Parsha, which when they are together are actually part of the same Aliyah. Revi'i takes you from the latter part of Behar into Bechukotai, and that is Et Shabtotai Tishmoru Umikdashi Tirau Ani Hashem. It's also interesting to note, by the way, that in the Christian chapter breakdown, these are part of the same chapter, even though they're not even part of the same Parsha. So there certainly is some continuity to them, even though they are in separate Parshiot. So before the five elements are mentioned, again, there is that interlude of if you keep my statutes, so we're clearly in a different section, but it's above. We have at Shabtotai Tishmoru Umikdashi Tirau Ani Hashem, keep my Sabbaths, revere my sanctuary, I am God. And then we go on to Im Bechukotai Tilechu. Indeed, there we have it. We found our sixth parallel, and it fits the pattern remarkably. I think we've seen enough to establish that the pattern we've been investigating isn't the product of our overactive imagination. To the contrary, it seems very real. But it's one thing to find a pattern, it's entirely something else to understand its meaning. So let's turn our attention to that question. What are we as readers meant to take away from this connection between Parshat Bechukotai's opening and its connections to Genesis? To begin to parse the meaning of all these connections, let's begin with this last one, that of Shabbat. In pondering the language in Leviticus, the reader notices an interesting quality in the Torah's description of the Sabbath Israel is meant to keep. Et Shabtotai tishmoru, you shall keep my Sabbaths. What a strange thing to say. God seems rather possessive about God's Sabbath, wouldn't you say? Is there a difference between the Shabbat, right? V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, we say in other places, not at Shabbat Hashem or at Shabbati or Shabtotai. Is there a difference between the Sabbath and my Sabbath? I think there is. Let me explain. Generally speaking, the Bible is not really a theological book, in the sense that its purpose is not really to describe what it is like to be God. The Torah normally focuses on the relationship between humans and God, which is another thing entirely. There is, however, a notable exception to that, and it comes in the Genesis account of the very first Shabbat. This dovetails nicely with what we saw last week in Emor, and he will reference the fact that he developed this there. There, and there alone, we learn something about what it is like to be God. I'm not sure that's the only place, but we learn that after God finished creating the world, God devoted a day of creation to God's rest and to nothing else. And it turns out that God was positively thrilled with the Sabbath. God blessed the seventh day, Vayivarech Elokim et Yom HaShvi, Vayikadesh oto, and made it holy, Kivo Shavat mikol melachto, because God ceased from all God's work on that day. The Almighty was so very pleased with God's new Sabbath that God blessed it and sanctified it, for God wished to celebrate God's rest. The first of all Sabbaths was God's very own. Notice, and again we mentioned this in Parshat Emor, that this celebration of the Shabbat by God doesn't involve any humans, nor do humans at the time even know about it. We, the readers of the text many years after creation, know about it, but at the time, God didn't command Adam and Eve to observe that Shabbat or even tell them that God was resting. For all we know, Adam and Eve were entirely unaware of the Sabbath's existence. The first Sabbath was God's and God's alone. No one else shared in its experience. By the time we get to Leviticus, though, all that changed. God had since commanded Israel to join God in the celebration of these phenomena we call Sabbaths. And these Sabbaths come in all shapes and sizes. See our essay on Parshat Emor for details. Right there, we pointed out that Shabbat is a term that is used to describe all the Chagim in Parshat Emor and also the Shemitah and expands out to the Yovel. These are Sabbath-like occasions, which are modeled after God's first Breshit Sabbath. One such Sabbath occurs in the realm of years, the sabbatical or Shemitah year. For 6 years we work the land, but during the seventh year, the one we proclaim a Shabbat, we refrain from working the land or exhibiting dominion over it. The laws of this sabbatical year are the main focus in the Torah leading into Parshat Bechukotai, meaning it's what Behar is about, by and large. And in the verse just before the Parsha begins, the Torah concludes its discussion with the admonition that Israel is to observe my Sabbaths, which in context is clearly a reference to these sabbatical years. Shabtotai there doesn't mean God's seventh day days of the week. It means God's sabbatical years. So it is almost as if when we read those words, we are meant to conjure in our mind's eye the personal Sabbath in Genesis, the one in which the Almighty, alone in God's numinous solitude, celebrated God's completion of a universe. It is as if the text wants us to conflate the two, almost as if the text was telling us that Shabbat was experienced by God alone. But now that we are commanded to observe these sabbatical years, now that we are bidden to join with the Master of the universe in the experience of Shabbat, now the divine being would have some company in God's rest. Israel would join and be a part of it. And to further buttress this sense of conflating the two, consider how this admonition to keep my Sabbaths just happens to match up with God's original personal Sabbath in the creation story as the final element in a series of correspondences between Leviticus and Genesis. Right now we add these last ones, going through the story of the sixth and seventh days of creation ends with the Shabbat, and the forwards flow, now mirrored in reverse, of the blessings in Bechukotai, going up to including the very, very end of Bahar, begins with the Shabbat, which is really the Shemitah, and then goes through in reverse those same blessings. So let's take stock of where we are at. All in all, we've seen 6 elements that seem to connect a broad swath of text in Leviticus and Genesis, respectively. Not exceedingly long number of psukim, but still substantive sections. For the most part, it connects the blessings promised to Israel should they observe God's commands when they enter the land, to the blessings given to humankind during the primal 6th day of creation. But this pattern extends just a bit further as well. It goes on to encompass the Sabbath of the 7th day of creation and the sabbatical years of Leviticus. In the interest of rounding out our picture and seeing what it all might mean, I believe we actually need to extend our exploration just a bit further. Might it be possible that the parallels between these two sections of text extend still further? At first, the answer to that question seems to be no. To this point, the parallels between Leviticus and Genesis have unfolded in reverse order. Every step forward in Genesis took us another step backward in the Leviticus text. Well, the next thing we hear about in Genesis is the garden God plants in Eden, right? That's the continuation of chapter 2 of Breshit after the Shabbat text. Which means that if the parallels continued following that same pattern, remember why Eden matters. That was the quote from Rashi that got us started on this whole journey. I'm going to walk with you in the Garden of Eden. The next thing we hear out in Genesis is the garden God plants in Eden, which means that if the parallels continued following that same pattern, we would expect to find some sort of analog to the Garden of Eden earlier in Leviticus, right at the end of Bahar, right before the mention of keeping God's Sabbaths. And nothing at this point in Leviticus presents itself as a likely candidate for such a parallel. So it seems we are at the end of the line. But maybe not. When we get to the end, you may argue that he actually should have ended here, because it's a little bit of a twist, literally like twisting the text to make this second central point. But there's enough there again that it merits our consideration. Because it just so happens that right after all these parallels we found in Parshat Bechukotai, the promise of fruits, of vegetation, the removal of wild animals, vanquishing of enemies, and fertility, Right after all of that, and in the long footnote in number 3, he explains why after is okay, even though we're supposed to be going backwards in Bechukotai. If we're going forwards in Bereshit through Shabbat now to the planting of the Garden of Eden, then we should go backwards into the end of Bahar to get to a Garden of Eden parallel. And in fact, it's not before, but it's after. After all of that in Bechukotai, we do hear of something that reminds us suspiciously of the original garden. V'natati mishkani betochachem. I will have my presence dwell among you. Right? So that is, just to take us back in Bechukotai, we got through going forwards, which means we're following backwards up through the blessings to mankind. We got finally ending with fruitful and fertile and multiply. That took us all the way back to Pru or Vu. Maintain my covenant with you. Then we do have one additional verse, which he doesn't account for, of eating old grain. And then, V'natati mishkani betochachem, I will establish my abode in your midst. And then ultimately after that will be the Vihi talachti betochachem that Rashi was actually commenting on. This is the key phrase he wants to focus on now. I will establish my abode in your midst. Why, might you ask, does this sound like a Leviticus analog to the primal garden that God planted in Eden? Talking about this phrase, I will have my presence dwell among you. V'natati mishkani betochachem. Well, stop and think about the significance of that original paradisiacal garden. What really was the point of it? God had just made an entire world full of forests and lush vegetation. What was the special garden for? One might perhaps surmise the garden was there for the newly created people. Maybe the Lord wanted to make somewhere especially pretty to put these new humans God created. The garden was a gift to them, with its manicured trees and lush ferns. Could be, but I think the truth of the garden extends beyond this too. The garden wasn't just a place for humans, it was a place for God too. I don't think it's a coincidence that the verses in Genesis telling us of God's creating the garden immediately follow the advent of God's Shabbat. These two events, I'd suggest, are juxtaposed for a reason. What the Sabbath is to time, the garden is to space. It's interesting, of course, because, and he'll sort of relate back to this, we normally talk about what Shabbat is in time. The Mishkan is in space, right? Shabbat is sanctity in time, and the Mishkan is sanctity in space. So now he's going to argue that that sanctity in space's model is the Garden of Eden. To explain, God is a non-corporeal, non-time bound being. When we say that God created the world, we don't just mean that God created all the stuff, all the matter and energy that exists in the universe. We also mean that God created the environment in which all this stuff exists, which is to say that the Almighty created time and space itself. But as the creator of time and space, God's natural abode is outside of time and space. The divine being exists in a realm that is entirely beyond these constraints. I remember a conversation I once had with a self-professed atheist who wondered why, if God really exists, we don't see God all the time in this world of ours. The analogy I gave by way of reply came from the game Monopoly. Imagine a conversation, it wouldn't be a complete essay without one of his little silly metaphors. Imagine a conversation, silly, serious metaphors. Imagine a conversation between Little Hat and Little Shoe, these two Monopoly icons. They are making their way around the board, and somewhere between Tennessee Avenue and Park Place, Little Hat asks Little Shoe if he believes in Parker. Parker, replies Little Shoe. Who's that? Well, it says right over here on the side of the board, made by Parker Brothers. So, do you believe in Parker? Little Shoe is taken aback. Well, I guess so, he stammers. But Little Hat is not so sure. Me, I don't know. Look, I've been around this board dozens of times. Every week I pass go and collect $200. I've seen it all. Baltic Avenue, Boardwalk, you name it. Hey, I've even been to jail. But I never see Parker. What would you say to Little Hat? The answer is, he's been looking for Parker in all the wrong places. Parker doesn't live on the board. He made the board. It's the same way with God. The Almighty is the author of time and space. The author doesn't live in our world, the world of God's own making. Except that there's a problem with this. The problem is loneliness. We humans would be lonely without our Creator around. I can kind of hear Heschel in the background saying, our Creator would be lonely without we humans around, okay? But that's not the direction he's going right now. I mean, Rabbi Dr. Heschel would say both, but Rabbi Foreman's only saying one right now. We humans would be lonely without our Creator around. God's desire in making a world ultimately isn't simply to achieve a great feat of engineering. That engineering feat had a purpose. God wished to have a place where beings created in God's own image could live, and where God could relate to them. Now he's going to start to get into that. But ultimately, if God were to be limited to God's own world, and humans, these carbon based life forms, would be relegated exclusively to their own separate domain, well, sure, a relationship is possible from afar, but wouldn't it be better if there was some way that these two beings, God and humans, could really connect? Could they actually share an environment together? It's pretty lonely living all alone. How could God and humans actually share one another's company? We can think of Shabbat and Eden as two attempts on the part of God to do just that. The Shabbat was a place in our very human world of time in which God would reside. God would rest there. The word to be at rest in Hebrew seems related to the phonetically similar word to settle, shav. God, having been involved in a relentless flurry of creative activity, rests and comes to settle or reside in the Sabbath. But if the Sabbath is a place for God to reside in time, Eden would be the counterpart to that in the realm of space. Just another word on the Shabbat. Remember, we saw this last time in Emor about, the creator needs to ultimately separate from its creations and just exist alongside them. That was the idea of Shabbat. But if the Shabbat, okay, consider for a moment that according to the verses, Adam and Eve were not created in the garden. They were formed dust from the earth outside the garden, and then brought by God into the garden. Vayitash Elokim gan be'eden mikedim. God planted a garden eastward in Eden. Vayasem sham et ha'adam asher yatzar. And God put there the man whom God had formed. The garden was God's domain first, and God invited mankind to join God there. The notion of God's space may help us better understand the following verse, which appears halfway through the story of Adam and Eve, situated as they were in the Garden of Eden. Vayishmu et kol Hashem Elokim mitalech bagan leruach hayom. The humans, heard the voice of God strolling in the garden in the breeze of the day. The text conveys a remarkable scene here. The voice of God strolling through the garden in the afternoon. The ethereal aspects of the metaphor jump out at you. God, personified only by a voice without a body, is doing what one normally needs a body to do, stroll around a garden. But by making use of this metaphor, the text conveys to us something important about God's relationship to that special place on earth. For who exactly strolls through a garden in the afternoon? It's something the garden's owner might do. After all, how better to get some rest than to stroll through the grounds of one's garden on his premises after a long day's work? The gardener, that is to say, or the garden owner. So too here is God. So too, here is God walking through God's summer home in the realm of space, God's special garden. All in all, just after the Torah tells us about the Almighty's rest in the realm of time, now we're in Genesis now, we are told about God's resting place in the realm of space. Right after Shabbat comes the creation of the Garden of Eden. God wanted to enjoy the company of these humans God created, so God made a little summer home in space for God's self. God planted this garden, rested there, and invited humans to join God. As we might expect by now, all of this has echoes in Parshat Bechukotai too. V'natati mishkani b'tochachem. The promise in Parshat Bechukotai that God would have God's presence dwell among you suggests that the land of Israel could become what Eden once was, a special place in this world where God and a community of people could dwell in proximity to one another. To be sure, mankind's sojourn in the garden didn't last long. Humans, in the wake of their choice to eat the forbidden fruit, had been expelled from the garden, the place God had made for God's self in the world. But Parshat Bechukotai suggests enticingly, we don't have to take that banishment as destiny. We can do something about it. Sure, the God-made summer home called Eden remains off limits to us, but we humans can still try to construct a replacement, a man-made place for God. It turns out Israel can develop itself into a nation that can serve as a domicile for the divine presence, and we can invite God in. If the land of Israel had the potential to house a new Eden, how would man and God relate to one another in this new garden? How would they enjoy one another's company, so to speak? Here too, Parshat Bechukotai offers an answer drawn from the language of Eden, right? So after V'natati mishkani b'tochachem, after creating that, or God bringing God's presence into the garden type thing that humans are going to create, that Mishkan. Then the next pasuk, V'hitalachti betochachem, I will walk among you. That particular form of the root Hey Lamed Chet Halach is unusual. It is formulated in the Hitpa'el form, V'hithalachti, and it is a direct and unmistakable echo of that mysterious stroll in the afternoon that the Master of the Universe took back in Eden, right? V'hitalachti b'tochachem, and v'yishmu et kol Hashem Elokim mitalech bagan l'ruach hayom. Okay, so now the parallels continue. It's just that instead of going up before the beginning of Bechukotai, we've now gone down after the central verses in Bechukotai that parallel the central verses in Bereshit. What are the particular connotations of Hey Lamed Chet when it is conjugated this way in Hitpa'el? Well, typically Hitpa'el indicates action that is reflexive, when a certain subject is doing something to him or herself. So, for example, if you take the verb Lamed Vav should be vet, Lamed vet shin, which means to dress or wear, and you make it lehit labesh, that is, you put it in Hitpa'el form, then all of a sudden it's going to mean to get oneself dressed. But that doesn't quite seem to work in either the Genesis or the Leviticus version of the text describing God's walking. Because if Hey Lamed Chet means to walk, what would Lehit Halech mean? How do you even think about that reflexively? Was God taking God's self for a walk in the garden? Possibly, but that's a pretty awkward notion. There is, however, another intriguing possibility. Turns out that Hipa'el forms of verbs occasionally connote something else besides reflexive action. Sometimes Hitpa'el describes actions that two people or two beings do with one another. Like, for example, when the text in Genesis relates that Rebekah is pregnant with twins, the Torah uses the Hitpa'el form of the verb run and states, Vayidrotzitzu habanim bekirba. The two ran at one another in the womb. We find a similar use of Hitpa'el in modern Hebrew, where the Hit Katev means that two people are pen pals, that they correspond to one another, and where lehit kasher means that I reach out and talk to you on the phone. Pardon me. In all of these cases, Hitpa'el connotes mutual action. We might pause and ask, how strange of Hebrew grammar to do that. Why is there a particular grammatical form, Hitpa'el, that does two entirely different things? Why does it on the one hand connote reflexive action, a subject acting on itself, and on the other hand connote mutual action, two beings doing something together? The answer might be, when people do something together.
Why don't you get some water?
Good idea, Ida. Thank you. I'll be right back, everybody. Good. Thank you for the suggestion. Much better. Thank you, Edith. Okay, the answer might be, when people do something together, there is a hidden aspect of what they are doing that can well be viewed as reflexive action, as a unit acting upon itself. I think this is actually a beautiful idea. To explain, let's imagine two people are doing something together. How should we view that? One way to see it is to look at each individual person and their actions toward the other. But one might also look at both together. That is, one might say when two people engage in mutual action, there's a kind of new unit that's formed between the two of them, a kind of we. Above and beyond each person's individual activity, the unit, the we as it were, is acting on itself. How does this understanding impact the way we interpret God's being mitalech in Genesis and Leviticus? Let's take Genesis first. It provides the backdrop, I think, against which we need to understand Leviticus. Back in Genesis, the text signifies to us a kind of tragedy in how events unfolded there. Right? They heard the voice of God walking in the garden in the breeze of the day. The man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of God among the trees of the garden. Just before God's stroll, just before God's being mitalech in the garden, something had gone wrong. The people had eaten from the forbidden fruit, and they were now hiding from God in fear. They seemed to have perceived this as a gotcha moment. Here comes God to castigate us for what we've done. But were they correct? Remember the hitpa'el in that sentence. They didn't just hear the voice of God walking. They heard that voice walking in hitpa'el. What then did they really hear? They didn't hear God taking God's self on a walk. The hitpa'el seems to imply mutual action, two beings, God with humans walking together. God wasn't coming at them. God was coming to walk with them. That was God's intention. There was an invitation issued to the humans to engage with God in mutual action. Come walk with me. But at that very moment, Adam and Eve chose to hide. God was inviting the humans to join God on a stroll through the garden, but there was no answer to the invitation. God was ready to go on a stroll with God's precious humans, but they were nowhere to be found. One can detect the mournful overtones of God's question to them. Ayeka, where are you? By the way, I can relate to this sort of idea of after a child does something wrong and the parent starts trying to go after them, right? Like you might really just want to sit them down and say, hey, what happened here? Let's figure this out. But they assume, maybe based on prior experience, that you're going to be punishing them, or they fear you're going to be punishing them, and they're running away. It's like, I just want to talk to you. I just want to talk to you. But they've gone in their room and shut the door. So or they're on the couch with a pillow over their head. It's as if God was saying to them, I am here. I'm ready to enjoy a walk with you. But you, where did you go? How come you aren't here? The added tragedy of Eden is this. Not only did we humans sin, but we hid afterwards. We misinterpreted a moment of love, of joyful togetherness, for a moment of castigation. This was a chance to be together with God. It was God reaching out with an affirmation of our essential humanity and worth, even in the face of our sin. But it was a chance we were too afraid to take. When God reached out to us seeking to go walking with us, we were nowhere to be found. We recoiled from that invitation, thinking ourselves unworthy of it, thinking that God could be nothing other than disgusted with us. It was then that we truly withdrew from God. It was then that we all but chose exile from the garden. A few verses later, that exile in fact comes to pass. But that exile wasn't the last word. These Genesis parallels that we've detected in Parshat Bechukotai, they are meant to be the backdrop for understanding the verses in Leviticus. And they suggest that the broken hitpa'el of God's invitation back in Eden wasn't the last word. For in Parshat Bechukotai, we have an echo of that invitation in a new promise God holds out to us. Im bechukotai telechu, if you walk with my commands, all the blessings, etc., etc. V'natati mishkani betochachem, I'll place my, sanctuary amongst you. V'hitalachti betochachem, I will walk with you. Parshat Bechukotai tells us that God's voice will be back. In the land of Israel, we will hear a version of what we once heard back in the garden. God's voice, issuing an invitation. That invitation will come to us in the form of commands, statutes that God makes known to us through instruction that we can hear. God's promise in Parshat Bechukotai is that God's age-old invitation from Eden, still stands. This, I think, is what the sages meant by that enigmatic comment quoted by Rashi. What does it mean that God will walk with us now here in Bechukotai if we keep God's commandments? It is as if God will stroll with us together in the Garden of Eden. As Israel stands ready to enter the land, it stands poised to recreate a version of Eden, stands ready to realize the blessings that accompanied man's entrance to the original, mysterious summer home of God's on earth. Some of those blessings were material, success in conquest, dominion over animals, abundant produce. But one aspect of those blessings was transcendent in nature, the chance to go walking with God's voice. How do we go walking with God's voice in the land of Israel, God's new summer home? What does it mean in concrete terms to stroll with that voice? The prologue to Parshat Bechukotai tells us, if you walk with my commands, im bechukotai telechu. If you walk with my commands, these expressions of my voice, then you've taken me up on my invitation. And then v'hitalachti b'tochachem, then I will stroll with you. When we walk with God's voice too will walk with us, and togetherness with the Master of the universe can be had once more. So pretty, pretty epic essay here to conclude Vayikra together, and a sort of a big picture of this parallel to all the way back at creation of humankind, and the Eden as a first sanctuary space, Mishkan, or as he really more defines it broadly, Eretz Yisrael as the second, uh, and um, and the commands as the sort of medium for walking together. The hour is late, so we'll take a quick round of comments. I see Lance's hand as the first for now. Yep.
Okay, my question to you is, who is the most important person in the Garden of Eden? According to the essay we just read, it's God, right?
Potentially.
But I would suggest it's the snake.
Okay.
There's no mention in this essay whatever about the snake.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, there's no mention of the tochacha means both the blessings and the curses. And the curses in the tochacha, certainly, and here too, are much more severe and tormenting than are the blessings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it seems to me that what's really going on here is that a sadistic sociopath God is tormenting, torturing, and murdering his children. And even worse, it's a con, it's a scam. God says, well, if you do this, we're going to have a utopia, wonderful world, Eden, so on and so forth. There's no Eden. If France, Britain, and Canada and Republican senators are going to attack Israel, we're in hell. I'm sorry. I'm furious.
I hear you. I hear you. I'm just going to take out the piece, not, I'm going to highlight the piece of the question of where is the snake. And I think you've pointed out really interestingly whether we could carry this parallel forward, not in the reverse direction, but where he winds up going next, which is in the forwards direction, and see the episode of the snake, the punishment as the curse and the curses for, not keeping the commandments as in some way parallel to the Tochacha admonition section that follows in the second half of Bechukotai. It's a really interesting kind of continued dimension of the parallelism, and something to think about further. So I'll be keeping that in mind as we read the Parsha this Shabbat. Bracha, yes.
Yeah, I was, my voice is coming and going, but I was thinking about the word kivshuha, and last week when we were talking, I was saying about the whole thing of redu might not be the heavy dominion, but might be the going amongst them as a way of uh, of understanding them and working together with them. So I was also looking at the word kivshua, and it can't be coincidence that in the center of that word, I know it's a shin and it's not a sin, but I think there's a hint to keves, which is the peaceful way.
Nice. Nice. Yeah. So seeing a gentler version of things, as opposed to the more heavy-handed. Great. Thank you. Just looking around. Any other thoughts or comments? I know it was a long essay. It filled up the space. Hopefully it stood on its own, um, and gave us some more to think about as we approach the Parsha this Shabbat. And when we circle back to Breshit, we're kind of on the other side of the globe from Breshit, but we'll be back there before we know it. It's very much on my mind because Elon and I have started studying Parshat
Parshiot?
for his bar mitzvah. So
Oh my goodness.
that's
Oh, wow.
year and a half. Mark your calendars, please God. Breshit 2026. Lance, a last word before we go.
Yeah, look ahead in the Torah to the other talking animal.
Mm-hmm.
Who's the other talking animal?
Bilam's donkey
Exactly. And what does Bilam do to the donkey?
beats it.
Beats it, right. And that's, I think, a recursive miniature of human beings.
Interesting. All right, we'll leave it here, and we're going to be doing Rabbi Josh Fagelson's book for Bamidbar an opportunity to kind of delve into spiritual messages and conversation opening teachings. So it should be something, a whole different flavor. And look forward to doing that with you starting already next week. Let me take a moment to just double check my calendar. Let's see. Yes, it is. Oh, it is Memorial Day Monday, but that's still good for me. So anyone who's able to join Memorial Day Monday will be kicking off Bamidbar with Rabbi Josh Fagelson for the next number of weeks. So looking forward. Love to mom and dad. Good night to everybody. Great to learn with you.
Night. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.